Lo logramos de nuevo. Verizon fue nombrada por RootMetrics como la red más confiable del país y nuestros clientes nos calificaron como número 1 en calidad entre todas las redes del país según J.D. Power. Número 1 en confiabilidad 16 veces consecutivas. La red más premiada en calidad 27 veces consecutivas, demostrando una vez más que nadie diseña redes como Verizon. Por eso diseñamos 5G como debe ser. Por eso, mejor red hay solo una.
Welcome to this special Paley Front Row, a salute to Hispanic achievements in television presented by Citi. This program is the official kickoff of the Paley Center's annual Hispanic Heritage Month celebration, a salute to Hispanic achievements in television. We would like to thank our official sponsor, Verizon, for their generous support. I'm Marcela Isaza, journalist for the Associated Press. Throughout Hispanic Heritage Month, the Paley Center is celebrating many of the most important and influential icons, milestones, and achievements in the 8 decades of television history. In this conversation, I'm thrilled to welcome 3 people who are breaking barriers, shattering stereotypes, and changing perceptions with their outstanding work every day. We're going to discuss our journeys in TV, the pride we feel in representing the Hispanic community, and the importance of the Hispanic representation and inclusion throughout the landscape. I'm honored to welcome NBC News senior national correspondent and NBC News Now anchor, Tom Llamas. Also, we have with us ESPN baseball and softball analyst, Jessica Mendoza. And last but not least, we have actor, producer, and activist, Wilmer Valderrama. Wilmer.
Un placer.
¿Cómo estás?
Siempre bien.
Thank you all for joining us in this panel, and welcome to everyone watching. And please don't forget to subscribe to the Paley Center YouTube channel, link right below. As we begin this celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, I'd like for each of you to share something you consider to be an important example of the progress that the Hispanic community has made in media. And what is an example you'd each like to see in this next year? Wilmer, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely. So I think that there has been quite a few examples in where the Latino community, and specifically the Latino media, has really created an effortless way to broadcast a signal. We've kind of gathered around a lot of the things that have been really important to our communities and some of the things that have really affected us directly, you know. So when I think about, which I think your first question is like, is there an example of a moment, right? You know, I think that there's been definitive moments where we've come together and celebrated the community. But, you know, I guess in many ways, what I'd like to do is I'd like to reflect that kind of like, you know, where have we been in the last couple of years, right? I mean, I think that a lot of media and a lot of pop culture has been halted by, you know, this unfortunate moment of this, you know, historical moment of the pandemic, you know. So when I reflect back on like, what are some of those moments, I think it's how most artists and media and content has really been able to reflect on what's important to our communities that are the most vulnerable at the moment. But it is an exciting time. And, you know, there's tons of examples. It's hard to pick one, but I love to hear from my other colleagues and kind of follow suit.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in sports television, you know, where I think of moments is really the athletes, and the fact that, especially in baseball and softball too, and this was an Olympic year, so being able to see a lot of more Hispanic representation. I know for me, looking up to like Elisa Fernandez, and then, you know, just being able to see that continue on, influence so many young girls, which is huge in the sports space. For young girls, Hispanic girls, to be able to see more strong sports playing Hispanic women, you know, especially at the Olympic level. But on the baseball side, you know, I looked at like athletes like a Javier Baez, Salvador Perez. I mean, just so many, Vlad Guerrero Jr., everything that he's doing. And the personalities are coming out. And that to me, like culturally, it's one thing to be hitting home runs and the stats and people get excited. We've seen that for the last 40 years. Within the sport, but now to see like some of the bat flip and just some of like the culture that like I knew, like we're playing stickball in the backyard, like this is
That's
baseball. Right. So I get excited when you talk about moments this year. I think because of last year and the pandemic and not having baseball for so long, having a lot more social justice movements gave a lot more athletes their voice to be like, you know what? And I would say of all sports, baseball has always been the most quiet when it comes to this is who I am. And I've seen that really change a lot this year, is athletes not being afraid to stand up and be who they are. And I see it on the field now so much with just the like all over energy. I mean, Fernando Tatis Jr., like I know I'm throwing out all these for the non-baseball fans, but like Google so many of the players, just flat out like great MLB like players. And you will see that it is a predominant Hispanic bringing of so much of the culture, and I love it. Moving forward, though, I want to see a lot of those voices and players represented on the media end. I want to see more coverage of the stories and going behind the scenes and understanding. And that's where I think we need a ton of improvement. It's a lot of times I'm sitting in a meeting, and I'm sure you guys can relate to this, where I'm the only one that's talking about, hey, can we focus on like Venezuelan players separate from Cubans, separate from Puerto Rican, like understanding that Hispanic means so many different countries and diving into that. I just feel like a lot of times that it might be I'm the only voice representing a lot of the Hispanic players.
Yeah. I guess I'll pick it up from there, and I'll talk a little bit about the news side. I think at NBC News, we're trying to make great strides. I agree with everyone on this panel that a lot's being done, but a lot more needs to be done. For the first time, I think, in our history, maybe the history of network news, we have a president who's leading NBC News, Cesar Conde, and we have a vice president named Janelle Rodriguez, who's also Hispanic, who also has a top leadership role. And we have a lot of people who are Hispanic in front of the camera, people like me, people like Gabe Gutierrez, who's one of our correspondents, Miguel Almaguer, out of our LA bureau, Jose Diaz-Balart, who's leading the charge both at Telemundo and now MSNBC. And we're about to launch a show in 2 weeks on NBC News Now, which is our streaming platform. And I'm going to anchor the show, and I've made a commitment to cover Latin America every single night. So I have an hour of news. There's no reason why with 60 minutes of news, we don't have stories about Hispanics. It's the fastest growing population in America, right? Latin America is our backyard, right? Why aren't we seeing these stories more and more in the news? We are now with our show. So I think a lot is being done. I think what Lin-Manuel has done is just, it is so important because he's put our culture out there and he shared it with the masses. And I believe that it's led to even more sort of cultural expansion, right? People tap into this. They want to see In the Heights. They want to see the other movies. They want to listen to the music. And it's only better for us. But it comes to the question of, do movement create leaders or do leaders create movements? And I think leaders create movements. So I think we need more people like Lin-Manuel, like Cesar Conde, like Janelle, people like me, people like that are on this panel right now. The more of us that are out there making decisions, the more we can put the culture out there. I think a lot has been I think we're at a good point right now, but I can also remember in 2000 seeing the cover of Newsweek with Ricky Martin and salsa was the number one condiment, and it's the era of the Latinos. And it's like, that was 20 years ago, right? 21 years ago. And now we're still sort of having this conversation. So how come we're always on the cusp and we never kind of jump forward? And I think a lot of work still needs to be done.
It's Tom, I really appreciate what you're saying. And thank you, Jessica, for bringing that up too. I mean, I think there's a lot of personal achievements that have rippled pride within our communities, right? And Tom, what you said about leaders create movements, it's a very interesting thing because for the history of the Latino in media, it has been the achievements of a personal individual that has made us proud. So now what is the next phase of that, right? What is the phase of the leadership that you talk about, Tom, and the moments that you talk about, Jessica? I think you kind of bring it full circle to like, how do we, not just feel proud of our hometown heroes that we see on those screens that make us see ourselves, but how do we now elevate our community, our culture on that screen as well? And I think that is where we're incredibly behind on, right? Because studios and the networks are doing a very important job at like putting Jessica on in a leadership role, having Tom, in a leadership role and on screen, and then giving me roles like, I have a production company. I have a first look deal with CBS Studios. I have deals with Netflix and Disney and producing. And I'm in the podcast where I have my own podcast network now. And so I think about it's what the landscape looks like that eventually will bring the full circle, right? Because I agree. I think that consistently we've had individuals that have brought pride to our Latino community. But I think as we think about what the next phase is how do we now have not just the spirit, the heart, and the landscape, but how is our culture now the next hero? How is our culture the leader now? And I think that's where we kind of have to move forward with content and how we actually move things. And you bringing up, a piece of it, Tom, from Latin America, who are our neighbors, like you said, why are we not more interested in what's going on behind that border? And Jessica, you bringing up the individuals that are in the many flags that make the Latino community, into the forefront. It's a really heroic and important moment right now.
Absolutely. It goes beyond seeing somebody who looks like us on the screen. And, Jessica, I think you touched on this. It's hearing the stories, hearing the backstories, and that adds to the culture because that's where the connection is. It goes past just seeing another face that might look like you. I want to talk about the earliest portrayals of Hispanic life on television. Now, there weren't many, but I want each of you to talk about your earliest memories of Hispanic characters and life portrayed on TV. Can you recall how you felt about those particular representations?
I'll leave it to you guys first.
I can start. I had the benefit of growing up in Miami, which I always say it's a benefit because when I was growing up, Cuban Americans were already the majority in Miami, right? And so they had worked their way into positions of power. They had worked their way in front of the camera. They were producing shows which was very popular back then, called Que Pasa USA, which was a show about a Cuban American family living in Miami. And the show was sort of revolutionary because it was in English and Spanish at the same time. And it was so popular amongst Cuban Americans that you sort of grew up seeing people on TV that looked just like you, that sounded just like you. I had the benefit of growing up with Andy Garcia, watching him in TV and films. I remember when Andy Garcia got Godfather 3 and people were talking about that. It wasn't the best Godfather, but that there was a Cuban in Godfather 3 it was such a big moment for us. And then on the journalism side, there were people like Jose Diaz-Balart, like Jorge Ramos, who were always on TV as I was growing up. And it was important. And then even going really deep into the culture, Celia Cruz was always being played in the house, but we would always see her on TV on Sábado Gigante, right? And when someone would play a song like Guantanamera, I knew that the lyrics from that song came from a poem written by Jose Marti, who's Cuban, Cuban revolutionary before Castro. And so stuff like that was always taught to us, and we were always proud of it. So, I almost feel like I lived in a bubble in the sense that I was always reminded who was Cuban, who had made it, and sort of given a push, you can do it if you want to try it, right? It was kind of oh my God, that's so weird. How is he on TV? It was you could maybe do that too. You just got to work really hard because all those people obviously work very hard,
And now, Tom, we have you to look up to. So thank you. Jessica.
My dad was a coach. I grew up on sports fields, so everything for me was sports based. So growing up in LA, Chavez Ravine was home for me, Dodger Stadium, and seeing Fernando Valenzuela in the 80s. Being Mexican and what he did, Fernando Mania, for those that weren't aware, go see the documentary. It is unbelievable how he united a Hispanic community, specifically Mexican. And I remember going with my father and we'd have the Mexican flag, the hats, this feeling of he's one of us, and we felt so connected. I literally thought he was one of my uncles. He just felt like he was family, and seeing him just blow up and become world famous at a time when there was so much negativity around Chavez Ravine, Dodger Stadium, feeling like just white people coming in and blowing up this Mexican community to build that stadium for decades. You just didn't feel like you belonged. And I remember going to games as a kid. And then in high school, a very influential age to see Hispanic women. I remember watching, as a fundraiser, we got to go and watch an early showing of Selena. And we met Jennifer Lopez, and this is before she was a big deal at all. The movie hadn't even come out. But I remember going with my softball team. So all my, popular friends, people you want to fit in with. And I remember after the film and after meeting Jennifer, they were all like, oh my gosh, like being Hispanic is so cool. And they were singing the songs. And it was the first time, like all of like the blonde haired friends that I was like, thought it was cool to be Hispanic, thought it was cool to, and the influence that movie had, I remember just at a high school age, allowed me to really be proud of, my own background and the fact that like, this is something that, I always grew up listening to so many, different songs and being able to dress and be myself. It was a pivotal time in my life to be able to see Selena, the role that Jennifer Lopez played in that movie, and just making it mainstream in a way that I could take it back, when you're 14 years old and you're trying to fit in.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think back to my own childhood, and Wilmer, I know for yourself as an actor, I'm sure you might have had the same experience, but, talk to me about some of, the people that you looked up to on TV, and how did you feel about the representation that they were giving at that time?
Well, I grew up in Venezuela, right? So I was born in Miami, but I was raised in Venezuela. So growing up in Venezuela, you had a mix of two things, right? You had, probably 55%, all very rooted South American, content. It was Sábado Sensacional. We had Venevisión. We had Radio Caracas. We had all kinds of stuff over there. We had crazy sketch comedies, all in Spanish. So I grew up knowing already that we were awesome. Right. Like I grew up in a world where Latinos were Latinos. we weren't talking about ourselves like Latinos. We were talking ourselves as like people. So when I came to the United States, furthermore, let me just, before I go back to the United States, but when growing, the other 45% of content was content that was imported from everywhere else in the world. Right. So I grew up with, Charlie's Angels, Mission Impossible, Chips. What else? Obviously, I Love Lucy, and so on and so on. I can name all the highly syndicated ones, and they're all in Spanish, right? And I want to say that, when I came to the United States, those shows were exciting for me to know. I technically did see myself in Punch, right? I saw myself in, Puncharelli in Chips, and I definitely saw myself in Desi Arnaz, but not until I came to the United States, when I heard them in English, is when I really identified with Desi Arnaz. I was 13, 14 years old. I came to the United States. I was watching what television was here, and it literally told me we were something else. Right. I grew up in Venezuela with an impression that we were majority, that we were, what we were. So when we came to America and I saw how we were portrayed on television and that present, I went back to some of the shows that I really liked. And hearing Desi Arnaz have an accent told me that I could do this too. It told me that I could also be an actor, right? And I grew up, dancing, singing, and acting back in Venezuela since I was 6 years old. And I did it only for fun in the school, because we grew up in a small little town, and there was one movie theater. Then they play RoboCop all year round, and just to tell you what kind of towns we kind of grew up in, like very little in el centro del monte, o sea, like really, really in the farm field stuff, So when we came here and I saw myself in some of these characters, I didn't have a lot of them that I looked up to, but Desi Arnaz was one of those, and I think throughout the years I saw certain individuals come and cut through pop culture like a juggernaut.
It's interesting to think back of Desi Arnaz when we would watch it on television and think, oh, wow, there's somebody on TV with an accent. And to think back then that it just stood out to us so much. And now it's just so normal, but it just shows you how long we've come. And this year actually marks the 70th anniversary of the premiere of I Love Lucy. I cannot believe it, 70 years. And so the Paley Center's Hispanic Heritage Month celebration includes a spotlight tribute to the iconic Desi Arnaz Jr. and his incredible legacy of innovation in TV. Can each of you share your own thoughts on his impact on television and the importance of his pioneering presence as a Hispanic star?
I grew up with I Love Lucy. Not that I feel old saying that, but my mom, that was her favorite show growing up. And so we watched, it's just funny that you bring that up, because he reminded me so much of my father, Desi Arnaz, in that role. And, just the humor, there was always like that. There's something, especially for back then, but there's trying to think of the right word, because it's not sexual, but it's definitely that, like, for TV back then, he had more of that, like, even with, I Love Lucy, I know they were married at the time and all of that, but you kind of felt his like love. And there was something there that came across the screen, whereas everything, especially black and white, was always so like literally black and white. Like, here's the wife, here's the husband. But he had that, like, just the touching and the feeling and the laughter, and with the neighbors, he had that charisma that was so much the Hispanic men in my life that I knew. And from a relationship standpoint, the way that he could make people laugh on the show, and you could tell that it wasn't even like the scripted laughter that like you would hear, but you would catch people off guard. He had such a humor to him that really brought it home for me. It was my father. And besides the fact that they had to sleep in separate twin beds, which I laugh at now, back then. But I remember, like, with the music, everything that he did, but it was the way he moved that jumped across the screen to me, because when you watch television back then, men just didn't move like that. And it was definitely the men that I knew that just, and I don't know, there's no word to describe like that, but it was amazing to have that growing up as a kid.
Like a male sass.
Yes, right. And I use that, I don't mean to say it like, but it was like, oh, like, just, you could feel his passion and everything about him, instead of it being like, here I am robotically doing my acting. Yes.
Tom, how about for you?
Yeah, Ricky Ricardo was Cuban, and it was big for us because our parents always would point out when somebody was Cuban who we didn't know. They would always say, "Ese es cubano." They would always tell you, like, to make sure you sort of checked it off that you knew this person was also from the same country that your parents were from. And when I remember my takeaway thinking about it, because again, like, it was syndicated, so it was on US TV. It was like all there was, because before streaming, right? It was like reruns during the day. And so, but what I remember about Ricky Ricardo and Desi Arnaz was the character. He was always working, right? He was always in the nightclub. He was always trying to get the band together. He was always working. And as a Cuban, that's very Cuban in the sense that, like, you're always taught to work very hard. And thinking back on that, I do remember that, and our parents would always point out too that you would see the Desi Lou productions, right? So not only were they the actors, they were also, the businessmen of the show as well. Him and Lucy, Desi Arnaz and Lucy. And that's something that, my parents obviously wanted me to understand as well, that it was like, they had almost two jobs. They were acting and they were producing. They were handling the books and they were also handling the entertainment. And that's something that's important, because in life, and I'm sure, Wilmer can talk about this a lot more than I can, it is important, right? Because it's one thing to be in front of the camera, but it's also another thing to be making the decisions.
Yeah, and controlling your faith. I think that's a good point, Tom. And I agree, that our Latino community has a very funny way of saying, like, oh, that's a Latino. But when they're from their country, they're like, oh, no, ese cubano, ese boricua,
Yeah, exactly.
It's very funny, But I coming full circle to what you're saying. And you talked about innovation, Marcela, you talked about, you talked about the advances of television and, who was responsible for some of those. And when you think about the sense of ownership and being able to dictate your faith, that's something that Lucy Eval and Desi Arnaz did, and, I think a lot about what they technology wise do. And, the process of shooting a sitcom, having a multi-camera, format, that's something that's never been seen, capturing something so live that you not only were efficient, but you really capture comedy a lot more organically than you ever did. And I think that's why you had all those very candid and very organic moments on television, because you were able to shoot from all these different angles, you know. And I think that is something that helped the sitcom, you know, universe, you know, for decades and decades. I mean, I speak for for myself, when I did 8 years and 200 episodes of That 70s Show. And, you know, being on set with 4 cameras and a live audience, I mean, that's literally coming full circle to everything I thought I wanted to be, you know, looking at Desi and being on set and making people laugh like he was, and I having an accent like he did. You know, it was like a lot of stuff that our characters were different about, but there was a lot of things that they had in common. And I just felt, you know, when I look back, you know, about what they've contributed, it's been incredible. But, you know, Tom, to your point, you know, Desi doesn't get enough credit for how much of the hustle he did.
Yeah.
You know, Desi was the guy who shaked and moved and put the sponsors and got them, you know, found the money and convinced all of them to empty their bank accounts on just doing the pilot of I Love Lucy and getting through the sponsors that would fall in and fall out before, because back then it was about sponsorship to actually fund your shows, right? So I think when you look back at that hustle, that betting on yourself, it is a very Latino thing. You know, it's a very Latino thing to bet on yourself, because you know that you can bet that you're gonna get up in the morning and get it done, right? So I think that's something that I think has driven me as well. But when I look back at Desi, you know, I feel like that's one thing that you know really spoke, you know, volumes in the test of time. You know, being able to do something that's so global that still today we're celebrating. So it's beautiful.
Yeah, the influences that we experience as children are so important, which is why I'm so excited that things have actually shifted. We've been talking about this, I think, for a long time, but I think it's finally happening and it's coming. I want each of you to now talk about, you know, who are some other Hispanic icons on TV. We can talk about actors, actresses, performers, artists, athletes, journalists, who were most influential to you when you were growing up and watching television.
I feel like this is where like it needs to change from like the female standpoint. I mean, I mentioned Jennifer Lopez, you know, growing up, but I feel from a television standpoint, we're improving on that. But I grew up watching Lisa Fernandez, who most people don't know who she is. She wasn't as mainstream, just doing a better job of showcasing female sports, but also telling the Hispanic stories that come along with the female audience. I mean, a lot of, I know sports wise that we do know are a lot of the male athletes, and that's becoming more and more popular, and it has been for a while, but there's still so many young Hispanic girls that do not have the sport limelight. They see it definitely in television, for sure in music, in places, but not in the sports space enough. And they're out there, their stories are out there. We've come a long way with the men. But that's just me trying to push more of these strong Hispanic women that are like just killing it in the sports that they're doing. And so being able to be, as Tom said, and by the way, Tom, I'm so grateful that you are pushing with your show to make it a priority to do it every single time, and not just Hispanic Heritage Month when everyone's clamoring to like, oh, let's tell all the Hispanic stories. Let's do it every single day, all year long. And in the sports world, it's a battle for just female sports. A lot of times, like you look at like the amount of sports that are on television, but these strong like Hispanic women, how important it is. Angel City, the new soccer team, is doing a really good job with that, but they're also trying to reach more of the Hispanic community, but with their women's soccer team that's in LA. And I'm so excited because they get it and the impact that makes on a lot of young girls.
You know, before we wrap, I really want to ask you guys about the impact that you guys have individually on your audiences, because we're talking about an influence. And right now, the three of you are an influence on young Hispanic children that are watching television, movies, films, sports, news, so, both Hispanic and otherwise. In looking at how you approach your role in what you do now, do you feel an added pressure given how prominent and influential you are in representing the Hispanic community?
I mean, I think it's been more critical than ever. I mean, I think the last 10 years, specifically the last 6 years of the history of our culture has been attacked for a long time. I think a lot has been publicly been tried to undone of contribution wise. I feel like there is, we have a moment right now to really certify, not just our contribution, but our role and to stand up for authenticity and, and the roots. Most importantly, after all, this is entertainment and we are in the business of entertainment and we want to entertain everyone. But we have a level of responsibility for those stories that we put on the air. I mean, specifically myself, when, with the company I have, I'm launching a new studio for Latinx stories as well. And the idea is to elevate. Sure, reflection is important, but reflection can actually be very painful. And reliving, our history could also be very traumatic. And how we take this young, you bring up the young community, where do we take this young community next? Is we gotta show them and elevate them on screen so they know that everything is possible. So their next generation of Latinos actually go knowing that absolutely anything they want to do, they can. That they not only are a part of this national community, but they are a vital, essential component of the DNA of this country and the world. I mean, our contribution is not just in the United States, our contribution is global. And when you think about that, and when you think about how we've represented it and how we have somehow organically, historically recorded it, it is a catastrophe. It is a catastrophe in how we have not been more historically recorded for our organic contribution as a culture to the national and to the global communities. And the reason why I say historically recorded is because I think as entertainment and we have a responsibility to continue to immortalize our contribution and making sure that they live on forever. So yes, we do have a responsibility, but we should never forget that this is also a business and this is also entertainment. And there's so much responsibility that we ourselves have to take. This is a collaboration with local leaders, national leaders, communities, and activism. This is a collaboration with all those individuals that are doing the same fight. We just happen to be doing it based on our strength. Tom and Jessica, we're all using our perspective platforms to continue to create a cohesive and very, very integrated conversation that it is a reflection of where we should be going. And I think that is where we're at. And that's the responsibility. We have a path, but I do believe we have a window to certify and to cement, what we can be tomorrow. And it's right now.
Tom, your segment, The Americas, about Latin America, is, you just touched on it. And that I think is very important that you're going to be highlighting these significant stories. Talk to me a little bit about how, you're going to cover especially these stories that are going to be important to Hispanic Americans.
Right. So we're building a partnership with Telemundo, and Telemundo is owned by Comcast, which also owns NBC. And so there are partners in gathering news. So I'll sometimes file stories for Telemundo. Like I was at the Olympics and I would do stories for Telemundo. So we'll have some of their correspondents filing stories for us. We have enough people on our team that are bilingual that will be able to translate scripts if they're in the region somewhere and we want to use one of our correspondents. And I think I just think it's time. And there's really no reason not to have these stories, because the story, when you cover the border, we go to the border a lot, and it's like when there's an influx of immigrants at the border, which is every day now. And the story sometimes is how they're crossing the border, but the story really is why are they crossing the border? And the way you tell that story is by going to the region, by going to those countries, by telling the stories about what's happening to farmers in El Salvador, right? Or what's happening to people being oppressed in Cuba, right? When they can't get COVID medicines, when they're not getting the correct information from their government. And I think that's all important, right? As I mentioned, Hispanics are the fastest growing population in the US. More and more people are speaking Spanish in the US. So it's my hope that I can help educate everyone who's out there who's watching the show to understand these issues and to understand the culture. Because I think when we start listening to each other is when we start to lose the prejudice. I think prejudice and racism comes when we stop listening and we sort of have our bias and we only listen to the same people. When we expand our conversations, we learn more. You said if there was a pressure, right, being in front of the camera and having this sort of platform, I don't think there's a pressure. I think it's a responsibility, right? I am fully cognizant that 6, 7, 10 million people could watch us on any given night when I'm anchoring a network newscast. I'm also fully cognizant that there's not a lot of people with the last name Llamas who have ever anchored a newscast like that. So what's my responsibility? My responsibility is just to make sure that my voice is being heard and the people that I come from, those people are being heard as well. And it's small things. It's things on, hey guys, maybe we should cover the border story this way. Let's try to do this. It's talking to somebody who's on the border in Spanish, because I speak Spanish and they speak Spanish and there's no translator, and I can get the exact story that they're saying, why they're leaving, and I can deliver that directly to the American people. But it's also small things like when Maradona dies, right? And someone says, oh, that's just like a 10-second reader. And I'm like, no. This is an epic story. This guy was a sports icon, not only in Argentina and all of South America, but in Europe. And this guy deserves time, right? He wasn't a perfect person, but to a lot of people, he was a sports icon. So it's little things like that. And that's why newsrooms have to stay diverse, because unless you have those voices chiming in, people are just going to roll over you, right? And so that's why, whether it be in entertainment, in news and sports, we have to be at the table, because if we're not, we're never going to be heard.
Absolutely. I want to thank the three of you for joining us today, for giving us this incredibly valuable information, your insight, your experience. Thank you guys very much. Thank you for joining us for this Paley Front Row presented by Citi. Thanks again for the invaluable support from our official sponsor, Verizon. Don't forget to subscribe to the Paley Center YouTube channel right now. Just click on the subscription button right below this video. Be sure to support the Paley Center and consider becoming a Paley member by visiting paleycenter.org.